welcome back to the Evolving Media podcast where we talk to some brilliant people about the changes in the media industry from the point of view of the storytellers, creators and producers in the industry. You can help this podcast immensely by subscribing to it, rating it on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and sharing it on your favorite social media platforms. It'll help us make more of these episodes, so if you have the time, please consider helping out. My guest this week is the creative powerhouse that is Christy Dena. She's a writer, designer and director, running her own company, Universe Creation 101, and balancing her work as an educator, creating international labs, working as a senior interdisciplinary lecturer in remote and experimental practice, developing creative projects, and currently writing a book. I'm delighted that she took some time off to have a chat about a very specific angle of the content and story development process, the need to develop from the start with the audience experience in mind. Links to the resources that come up in the discussion can be found in the description of this episode. Welcome. Hi, Christy, and welcome to the podcast. Very happy to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invite, Simon.
So listen, first off, how's things in Australia? I'm just hearing that totally different from Midwest US. You're experiencing the worst heat waves in Australian history. How are you coping?
Yes, it is hot in Australia, but I've actually moved back to Melbourne, and Melbourne pretty much intersperses with its weather. You know, we have a hot day, and then it breaks pretty quickly. So we suddenly have a cool change. And so it's actually quite pleasant. I personally am I'm not feeling the heat. Although, yes, last week was it 44 degrees, 111 degrees Fahrenheit?
Oh, wow.
But I decided to go for a ride, which was a really silly decision.
A bike ride.
But yes, in that heat, I thought I could beat it before it got too harsh, and I made sure I wore all white, and of course lots of sunscreen. The body just couldn't wait to get out of the sun. Most definitely by the time I got back.
Yeah, we've been having minus 20 or something here in Finland. So if you could just export some of that heat over here, we'd be very, very grateful. So listen, this podcast is about, storytelling, about how media is evolving and how, especially a lot about how the relationship between creators, producers and the audience have been changing over the past years and past decades and so forth. And it's a rapid change, and it's driven by from all sides, audience habits, but also new possibilities for creators and for producers. And you've been focusing a lot about, putting the audience experiences in the center of the design process. So if we could talk a little bit about that, like what's the difference when we're talking about developing, like in quotation marks, a normal project and a project that where you're looking at the audience's journey and the audience's experiences as a central part of the design process. How do you view that?
Well, I mean, yeah, you said in quotation marks normal. Yeah, of course, there is no normal. There's just some people that have decided and agree that there is a better way to do it. And some people follow along with that because they don't realize, because they agree with the rationale. They don't think that there's other ways to do it, or they think that there's possibly a high cost to doing something different. But there isn't a normal. There's just what people agree to do, for a while. And that's what I find interesting is like, well, why did we agree on that? And is it helpful? And this is a thing that I've found as the years have gone by, learning through practice and researching history and researching what different art forms are doing, is just realizing that I could actually use structures and processes that resonate with me, and which may entail me to create new things. And coming back to your point, that has been this shift towards a audience-oriented approach, and I've come full circle back to an artist and audience combination there. But there's been a few things that have happened along that journey, and alternate reality games is one thing that really opened it up for me. The experiences, the interactive experiences, which are experienced live in the world, and I'm not telling this to you. I'm just, just sharing it for someone. Experience in the street, experience through emails and lots of different areas. And that's the thing that ignited me when it came to interactivity. It wasn't digital games, in earlier childhood, and that they just did not capture my imagination. It was the blend of the social and the real world and the connection globally that really fired me up. And I've always been interested in, why that has appealed to me, but also how I can create works that are meaningful to me and my audience, to both of us. And the other question of how can I change the world, or as I've got older, at least my own world? And with that, I look out for things in creative practice, but also, outside of creative practice. And there's been a few key points that have suddenly sort of ignited different understandings on this journey. And one of them is in the startup scene, actually, the startup culture, and the idea of the customer development model. It was actually Stephen Blank's book, The 4 Steps to Epiphany, which was the key text for me in really opening this area up. And he just said that there's a lot of startups who focus on developing a product, developing a piece of tech or something like that to sell. And the equivalency in our creative world is, just focus on the film and the product and the craft of the product. But he said that there are the startups that he found that were the most successful were the ones that actually have a customer development model in which they try to find out if you actually have a customer. Before you actually put a whole lot of effort into spending time and money on a product.
Well, that sounds reasonable.
That sounds reasonable. Yeah, it's it makes complete sense now. But at the same time, when you're coming from a art world perspective, the whole idea of being driven entirely by what customers want, seems deficient, because it is in some ways. It's one of the problems. Well, that's not a problem. It's just startup culture does not have in its processes the idea of what the creators are actually bringing to the table in some way. It's a bit leaning in the other direction. But that was one of the ones that sort of opened me up to, oh, hang on, I can actually integrate the customer, as they were called, but people into my process. Mm-hmm. And then it was games after that. Sort of going more into games and the playtesting that actually happens when you're developing a game, because it involves interactivity and because that people actually have to act on things in order for it to progress. You need to know ahead of time whether or not that is working. It's very rare to be able to make a game without it actually touching a player before you release it. So the whole model of playtesting, actually, as you're actually bringing the audience, bringing the players in very early, was another influence there. But ironically, even though it has the player involved, it's often a culture that's very product oriented. They're crafting a game and they're finding out if it's getting the players to do the things they want. And then after that, it was actually a screenwriting approach. It was, which is called the sequence technique, which was developed by Frank Daniel, and it was actually popularized by Frank Gulino. And with that technique, what they basically looked at once again was, what are the most successful screenwriting plays that are out there, and what's happening with all of them? And what they found was that they're actually considering the audience experience of the film as they're actually watching it, but they've embedded that into the writing process. And so with that, they created a structure, for instance, is breaking up a film into sequences. And each sequence is not, what happens to the character necessarily. It's driven by what the audience is thinking about what will happen. And all of this is sort of coalesced, but I still felt I wasn't there yet. I know I was getting closer, but I wasn't there. And it was actually a education structure, that the one that brought them all together. And this is one that was developed by a gentleman called Jack Mezirow. And this was actually in the 1970s when he was teaching, he was doing a lot of adult learning for women who were returning to study after major life events. So in the 1970s, this was a time when people were actually deciding, oh, so we can divorce? I think I'll go off and live my own life now. And what he noticed with these women and how their lives were completely transformed was that there were patterns in what was happening with their transformation. And so he developed a structure of phases of transformational learning. So what happens when someone's worldview is transformed and what is needed for that to happen? And so since the 1970s, there has been lots of development of this in education and beyond. And so it was actually that technique, which was the thing that clinched it for me. And I'll give you a quick example of why and I guess how.
Yeah. So
you're familiar with an inciting incident?
Yep.
With a story. Yep. So an inciting incident, this is what, we're sort of taught in storytelling to start our story with. And I'll read out a bit here from Blake Snyder's book, Save the Cat, because this is just an example of a very popular book that's influenced a lot of screenwriters and non-screenwriters around the world. And so he describes it as the catalyst. But he says here, he's giving examples from some films. The package that arrives in Romance in the Stone, which will send Joan Wilder to South America. It's the telephone call that informs Tom Cruise his father has died in Rain Man. It's the dinner in which Reese Witherspoon's fiancé announces he's dumping her in Legally Blonde. These are the catalytic moments. The telegrams are getting fired, they're catching the wife in bed with the other man, etc., etc. This is the things that basically change the world of the character. Now, in the transformational learning structure, the first step is called the disorienting dilemma. And it is in the real world. It is the moment when you divorce, for instance, you have a major job change, there's been a death of a loved one. It is basically precipitated. Your world as it is can no longer exist. That you and the way you have conceived of the world has to change. You have to change. And it was at this point when I saw this, I suddenly realized, oh, hang on. When we're creating an inciting incident, it's an inciting incident that affects the character, but it's not an inciting incident for the audience or the player. And this is one of the examples of just how I find that the current models are about a particular way of seeing the world, where you can only change if it's forced on you. And that change is only there for the characters, not for the audience.
When we started this conversation, you said that creators, producers are hesitant to approach this kind of possibility or these opportunities because they perceive there to be costs involved, which I understand perfectly. I mean, it's cost. It could be monetary costs, and it could be creative costs, and it could be time-wise. It could obviously be a lot of costs involved, right? But so from your point of view, why would creators be interested in pursuing this? Why should producers and creators of content try to affect the audience in this way?
Well, one thing I've learned is that you can't use the logic of one reality to take people to another one. So, for instance, if I say you'll make more money if you have a female lead in your film, then the person may make one film with a female lead, but they haven't changed their habits or their routines or their beliefs or values in any way. So there's actually a whole cultural shift that is needed for that to happen. So, and so therefore, the reasoning for doing this, is not, hey, you'll make more money, or it's the only way to do this, because it's not. There are lots of structures out there, and for very good reason, because you need to actually pick a structure that suits what you're trying to do, suits you as a creator and what you are trying to achieve with the work that you're creating. So this is for people who realize that their creative work is a reflection of their inner world, of their inner work. For people who want to find meaning in the projects that they make as a reflection of what they have actually gone through, and that they want to pass that on as a gift for other people to facilitate it for other people. Once again, this is about choice for the audience. It's not about forcing transformation. This is, specifically for projects and for audiences that have that change stance, are actually wanting to go through a change.
Now, I would imagine that if you can affect change within the audience, or you can help the audience to not just experience what you have created, but actually engage with it and have that change how they relate to your story, then that would foster more loyalty. That would, if you engage in something, you obviously become more interested in that thing, unless you rebel against it, which is another side of the coin, I guess. So is this a way to build a more longer-reaching story, a more longer-reaching narrative over time, and how to take that into consideration?
Yes, exactly. It's the entire process does take time. So you can't completely change your worldview, for instance, in 10 minutes or 2 hours. You can have a transformation of perspective, but then there's the integrating it. Then there's the pushing against it. There's the considerations. There's the practicing, and moving beyond that. And this is where it overlaps with the work that I've been doing with cross media all these years of not seeing a project as being a single moment in time, but one which correlates what's happening in service design, where it's actually an entire journey. There's the point in which they discover the project. There's the point in which they're considering to go ahead with the project. And there's what happens after the project and the follow-up material. So you are creating a service, if you like, or an entire experience approach. But you don't have to necessarily do all of it. You can just do parts of it and point people to other projects and resources that do other things.
Now, I had a former colleague of mine on this podcast a month ago, just about, and Thomas Lind, and he was talking a lot about the need to reach out to audiences, but also to find out who your audience is, which seems also like a very natural part of any creative process, right? The more you know about who you're trying to target, or who you're trying to reach, or who you're trying to affect, the better you can create stuff that will actually accomplish what you try to achieve. But in this setting, are there projects that would be more suited to this vein of storytelling than others? And is it a requisite that you really know who your audience is? Or is it a possibility to throw stuff out there and see what happens? That's always a possibility, but is it something that could have any success to it?
I like that last bit. Could it have any success? So one of the things that has helped me a lot in understanding audience, because often audience understanding who your audience segments are and all of that is can be quite shallow. It's like, oh, they share an interest here, or they like the art form. But with this approach, one of the methods that I found really helpful is one from social media marketing, but the term is misrepresentative because it's not actually marketing in social media. It's actually social issues marketing. And what they found was that you need to target your campaigns appropriately to 4 different types of audiences that correlate with 4 different change phases. And those are people that are in pre-contemplation. So they haven't yet thought about changing for various reasons. They have no idea that it's a possibility, or they just don't think it'll apply to them. Then there are the ones who are actually contemplating it, and they're weighing up the pros and cons about whether or not it's something for them. There are the ones that are beyond contemplation and are interested in moving further but don't quite know how. And then there are the ones who are on the road, who are attempting to do it but need assistance in continuing the actual journey, the maintenance of the journey. And I find that sort of structure really helpful because, one of the things they talk about is do not aim for the people who are pre-contemplation because there's a whole lot of work that has to go into that. But also, I don't think it's possible to actually target people who aren't interested. They need to drive themselves. They need to actually make the decision to want to do it themselves. So I find that really helpful. And then in terms of what project is appropriate, it's a case of, what's the topic of worldview shift that you're actually looking at? And that's based on your own personal experiences. You can't create these kind of works if you haven't gone through that worldview change. This is why it's both sides of the table. It's audience-oriented and artist-oriented. And then it's just the story that's actually appropriate for this. And we have so many different models and structures. There's over 60 different structures out there. That's just counting all the different structures for genres that's out there. We've got Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, Christopher Vogler's hero's journey, Maureen Murdoch's heroine's journey, Kim Hudson's virgin's journey, Steve Kaplan's comic hero's journey. Like, we've got so many structures, but for very good reason, because you fit them to the project and what you're trying to achieve and the thematic point that is going on. And it's the same with this. Like, this is another structure. The first person transformation journey is another structure that you use for particular projects.
Just a final question. People listening to this and finding that this is something that they would need or want to start integrating in what they're creating and what they're producing and what they're trying to reach people with. How do you get started? Your journey has been quite long up to this point where you have this knowledge and you know what different possibilities there are. But how do you start out? What are the first steps and what are the first mistakes to make if you're interested in pursuing this?
I am actually bringing it out as a book. So there will be taking people through all the different steps. So there will be a resource in which I'm gathering all of the studies and all of the projects that help illuminate this beyond, my own epiphanies there. But for now, I think what is the most important thing that you could do is, as I said, you can't make these kind of projects unless you've actually experienced the worldview shift or in the process of experiencing the worldview shift that you're talking about. Most likely the latter, because it helps to discover it as you're actually going. And so with that, you need to document what you're actually going through at each point, because as you're actually progressing through major worldview shifts, you sometimes forget. You stretch so far that you forget the way you saw things in the very early days. And you need those very early perceptions in order to be there for your audience as they move through. And so it's a case of note taking and being very observant of the processes that you're going through, but also researching others, research what other people have done, interviewing them, all of that. So you can be doing the groundwork for that provides the grit, the substance that you then draw on once you're actually applying that to a structure.
That makes total sense. It's like if you want to start live streaming something, you need to try it out from all the different angles, from a participatory chat member to a streamer, etc. So you get all the knowledge, but to document it all, that's one thing that I think many people, me including, are pretty bad at. I'll remember this in 2 years' time. Yeah, of course I will. That's gonna happen.
Yeah, it's always this weird thing when you suddenly have an insight and you feel as if it'll be with you forever, right at that moment. And so it sort of works against the spirit of note taking, because you feel as if, it's tattooed on your consciousness in some way. I guess the essence of it is, but it isn't there. Like it will wash off in the rain. It will wash off over time. And so learning to capture those is really important. And this is where, techniques, for instance, from the wonderful book, The Artist's Way, using your morning pages to, sort of get into the habit of writing your things down, having a notebook as you're running around. I personally use the Notes app on my desktop and on my phone. I think a lot of creators will be in the habit of writing things down, but I think writing down your perspective shifts, that's the critical thing.
Christy, thank you so much for being on this podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. And as we said before we started recording, we could talk for hours and hours about all sorts of topics. But I'd be very happy to have you back on the podcast in the future as well.
Hey, thank you very much for inviting me and for talking with me about this. I've really enjoyed hearing your questions, and we can continue chatting after and hearing your thoughts. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you, Christy. Bye.
Bye.